Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. Olbers's paradox: why the night sky is dark when it should blaze with light. Look up at the night sky and you see darkness, scattered stars against a black background, empty space between the points of light. And this seems natural, seems obvious. The sky's dark because there are not many stars, because most of space is empty. But in an infinite, eternal universe filled with stars, this darkness becomes paradoxical, becomes something that should not exist. And this is Olbers' paradox, named after German astronomer Heinrich Wilhelm Olbers, who discussed it in 1823, though the puzzle was recognized earlier by others, including Johannes Kepler and Edmund Halley. And the paradox asks why the night sky is dark, when simple reasoning suggests it should be blazing bright as the surface of the sun in every direction. The argument proceeds as follows. If the universe is infinite in spatial extent and has existed forever, and if stars are distributed roughly uniformly throughout this infinite space, then every line of sight from Earth, extended far enough, must eventually intersect the surface of a star, because in an infinite universe, with infinite stars, every direction contains a star somewhere along that sight line, perhaps nearby or perhaps trillions of light years away, but somewhere, and so the entire sky should be covered with stellar surfaces, should glow with the brightness of a star, and there should be no dark spaces, no black background, only light. And yet we see darkness. We see mostly empty space with occasional bright stars. And this contradiction is Olbers' paradox. Visualize the reasoning more carefully. Imagine dividing the universe into concentric shells around Earth, like layers of an onion, each shell at a different distance, and count how many stars are in each shell. A shell at distance r has volume proportional to r squared times the shell thickness, because the surface area of a sphere grows as r squared. And if stars are uniformly distributed, then the number of stars in the shell is proportional to r squared. But the brightness of each individual star falls off as 1 over r squared due to the inverse square law of light. Light spreads out as it travels. And so the total brightness contributed by all stars in a given shell is the number of stars times the brightness per star, which is r squared times 1 over r squared. And these factors cancel, and each shell contributes the same total brightness regardless of distance. And since there are infinitely many shells in an infinite universe, the total brightness is infinite, and the sky should be infinitely bright. And even if we account for stars blocking each other, eventually every sight line intersects a star, and the sky should glow uniformly with the brightness of stellar surfaces. The resolution of Olbers' paradox involves recognizing that the universe is not infinite and eternal in the way the paradox assumes. Modern cosmology tells us that the universe has a finite age, about 13.8 billion years, and light travels at a finite speed. And so we can only see light from stars within our observable horizon, stars whose light has had time to reach us. And this limits the number of stars we can see. And more importantly, the universe is expanding, and distant stars are receding from us, and their light is redshifted, stretched to longer wavelengths and lower energies by the expansion of space. And this redshift dims distant starlight. And for sufficiently distant stars, the redshift is so extreme that their light is shifted into the infrared or radio spectrum, invisible to our eyes. And the combination of finite age and cosmological expansion means that only a finite amount of starlight reaches us, and the night sky is dark. Not because stars are sparse, but because the universe has not existed long enough for light from all stars to reach us, and because expansion dims the light from distant sources. Another factor is the finite lifetime of stars. Stars are not eternal. They form, They shine for millions or billions of years, and they die. And in a finite age universe, not all regions have had time to form stars, and not all stars have been shining throughout cosmic history, and so the background radiation from stars is further reduced. And these factors combine to ensure that the night sky is dark despite the vast number of stars in the universe. The paradox also touches on thermodynamics and equilibrium, because if the universe were infinite, eternal, and static, with stars distributed uniformly, then eventually the radiation from all these stars would fill space uniformly. Space would reach thermal equilibrium with stellar surfaces, and everything would be at the same temperature as the surface of a star, about 6,000 degrees Kelvin, and Earth would be vaporized, life would be impossible, and the darkness of the night sky is evidence that the universe is not in thermal equilibrium, is not static and eternal, but is instead dynamic, expanding, and young. Olbers's paradox played a role in the development of modern cosmology. It was one piece of evidence that the universe cannot be static and eternal, that something must be different about the large-scale structure of space and time. And when Edwin Hubble discovered in the 1920s that the universe is expanding, that distant galaxies are receding from us, this provided a natural resolution to Olber's paradox. The expansion redshifts and dims distant light, preventing the accumulation of infinite brightness, and the finite age of the universe, confirmed by observations of the cosmic microwave background and the distribution of galaxies, completes the resolution, ensuring that we see only a finite amount of cosmic history, only the light from stars within our past light cone. The paradox also has poetic resonance. It asks why there is darkness, why night exists, why space is not filled with light. And the answer is that darkness is a consequence of time and change, of the universe having a beginning, of stars being born and dying, of space expanding and carrying light away. And darkness becomes not an absence, but a presence, not a void, but a canvas. Evidence of cosmic history, evidence of the dynamic evolving universe we inhabit. And the dark night sky, far from being empty or boring, is rich with information. Tells us about the finite age of the cosmos, about the expansion of space, about the distribution and evolution of stars and galaxies, and Olber's paradox, resolved but not forgotten, remains a reminder that even simple observations, like the darkness of night, can contain profound mysteries, can require deep theories to explain, and can reveal fundamental truths about the nature of the universe. The stars shine against the darkness, scattered lights in an empty sky, and the darkness itself is meaningful, is informative, is the signature of a finite age expanding universe. And Olber's paradox, resolved by modern cosmology, endures as a teaching tool, as an illustration of how seemingly simple questions can have complex answers, and as a monument to the human capacity to wonder about the ordinary, to see puzzles where others see only the familiar, and to pursue those puzzles until the universe reveals its secrets. Skolem's paradox. Set theory describes infinite sets of different sizes, and Georg Cantor proved that the real numbers are uncountably infinite, that they cannot be placed in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, that there are more real numbers than natural numbers. And this is one of the foundational results of modern mathematics, a theorem that establishes a hierarchy of infinities. But Thoralf Skolem discovered a paradox, or what appears to be a paradox, that threatens this result. And the paradox is that any consistent first-order theory that has an infinite model also has a countable model, a model where the domain consists of only countably many elements. And this is the Löwenheim-Skolem theorem, and applying it to set theory yields a troubling conclusion. If set theory is consistent, then it has a countable model, a model where the universe of sets is countably infinite. And yet within this model, the axioms of set theory are satisfied, including Cantor's theorem, which proves that the real numbers are uncountable. And so we have a countable model of set theory in which there exists an uncountable set. And this seems contradictory. How can a set be uncountable if the entire universe is countable? How can there be more real numbers than natural numbers if the whole model has only countably many elements? And this is Scolam's paradox. The resolution lies in understanding the distinction between internal and external perspectives, between how things appear from inside the model and how they appear from outside. From inside the countable model of set theory, all the axioms hold. Cantor's theorem is provable. The real numbers have no enumeration within the model. No bijection between the reals and the naturals exists as far as the model is concerned. And so internally, the reals are uncountable. But from outside the model, from the perspective of someone who can see the entire structure, the model itself has only countably many elements, and there exists a bijection between the elements of the model and the natural numbers. A bijection that is not itself an element of the model, that does not correspond to any set or function within the model. And so externally, the model is countable. And this distinction between internal and external is the key to resolving the paradox. Uncountability is relative. It depends on what bijections are available, and different models have different bijections. Scolam's paradox reveals something profound about the nature of mathematical existence and the limits of first-order logic. It shows that first-order logic cannot pin down the cardinality of infinite sets, that the concept of uncountability is not absolute but relative to a model, that what counts as uncountable in one model may be countable in another, and this relativity is a consequence of the expressive limitations of first-order logic, which can only quantify over elements of the domain, not over arbitrary functions or sets of elements. And so first-order set theory cannot express the existence of a bijection between two sets in an absolute way, cannot say, in a model-independent manner, that a set is countable or uncountable. Some philosophers and logicians find this relativity troubling, a sign that first-order set theory is inadequate as a foundation for mathematics, that a stronger logic, perhaps second-order logic, which allows quantification over sets and functions, is needed to capture the intended meaning of set theoretic concepts. And in second-order logic, the Löwenheim-Scolam theorem does not hold. There are categorical characterizations of structures, including characterizations of the natural numbers and the real numbers that pin down their cardinality uniquely, and so second-order logic avoids Scolam's paradox by being more expressive, by allowing statements that distinguish countable from uncountable models. But second-order logic has its own difficulties. It lacks complete proof systems. There is no algorithmic procedure that can, in principle, prove all second-order truths, and so the gain in expressiveness comes at the cost of losing some of the nice logical properties that first-order logic enjoys. Others embrace the relativity revealed by Scolam's paradox, arguing that it shows the conventional or perspectival nature of mathematical concepts, that cardinality is not an intrinsic property of sets but a relation between sets and models, that what we call uncountable is simply a set that lacks an enumeration within a particular model, and that different models can disagree about what is countable without any of them being wrong. And this perspective aligns with a pluralistic or model-theoretic approach to mathematics, where there is no single intended model of set theory, but many models, each with its own internal structure, and what is true varies from model to model, and mathematical truth is relative to a choice of model. Scolam's paradox also connects to issues about the definiteness of the continuum, about whether the set of real numbers has a well-defined cardinality, and the continuum hypothesis, which asks whether there is a set whose cardinality is strictly between that of the natural numbers and the real numbers. And this hypothesis is independent of the standard axioms of set theory, meaning that neither the hypothesis nor its negation can be proven from the axioms. And some mathematicians interpret this independence as evidence that the cardinality of the continuum is not a definite matter of fact, but depends on additional assumptions or on the choice of model. And Skolem's paradox reinforces this interpretation by showing that even the distinction between countable and uncountable is model-dependent. The paradox remains a touchstone in the philosophy of mathematics and the foundations of logic. It illustrates the limits of first-order logic, the relativity of model-theoretic notions, and the gap between formal systems and intended interpretations. And it forces careful thinking about what it means to say that a set is countable or uncountable, about whether mathematical concepts have absolute meanings or are always relative to a framework, and about the relationship between syntactic provability and semantic truth. And the paradox has no simple resolution. Different philosophers and mathematicians draw different lessons, some seeing it as a defect of first-order logic, others as a feature revealing deep truths about the nature of infinity and cardinality. And the debate continues, with implications for how we understand the foundations of mathematics, the status of set theory, and the nature of mathematical truth. The countable model sits in logical space, containing sets and functions and real numbers, and within this model, Cantor's theorem holds. The reals are uncountable, no enumeration exists, but from outside the model, the whole structure is countable. All its elements can be listed, and the real numbers of the model, uncountable internally, are countable externally. And this doubling of perspective, this split between internal and external, is the heart of Skolem's paradox, a demonstration that perspective matters, that truth is not always absolute, that models can disagree, and that first-order logic, powerful as it is, cannot capture all the nuances of infinite cardinality. And the paradox endures, a puzzle that has shaped logic and set theory, a challenge that continues to generate discussion and debate, and a reminder that even the most basic mathematical concepts, even the notion of how many, become subtle and contested when applied to infinite collections. Moore's paradox. The philosopher G. E. Moore identified a peculiar class of statements that seem absurd or irrational to assert, even though they may be true. And these statements take the form, "It is raining, but I do not believe it is raining," or "I believe it is raining, but it is not raining." And these statements, while not logical contradictions, strike us as deeply strange, as something no rational person would say. And this strangeness is Moore's paradox, a puzzle about the relationship between belief, assertion, and truth that has implications for epistemology, the philosophy of language, and the nature of self-knowledge. Consider the statement, "It is raining, but I do not believe it is raining," and suppose this statement is true. It really is raining, and the speaker genuinely does not believe it. Perhaps they are looking out the window, but not paying attention, or they are in a state of denial. And so the two conjuncts are both true, and there is no logical contradiction. The world can be such that it is raining, and such that someone does not believe it is raining. And yet if someone asserts this statement, if they say out loud, "It is raining, but I do not believe it is raining," the assertion seems absurd, self-defeating, almost incoherent. And the absurdity does not lie in the content of the statement, which may be true, but in the act of asserting it, in the pragmatic dimension of language use. The paradox arises because assertion carries an implicit commitment to belief. When someone asserts that P they normally implicate, even if they do not explicitly state that they believe P, that they take P to be true, and so asserting it is raining implicates that the speaker believes it is raining, but the second conjunct explicitly denies this belief, and so the assertion as a whole both implicates and denies that the speaker believes it is raining. And this creates a pragmatic contradiction, a clash not between the truth conditions of the statement, but between the commitments carried by different parts of the assertion. Ludwig Wittgenstein famously analysed Moore's paradox, arguing that it reveals something important about the grammar of belief, about the way belief and assertion are related. And Wittgenstein suggested that saying, "I believe P," is not a report of an inner mental state, not a description of something going on in the mind, but rather a different way of asserting P, a way of committing oneself to P with a certain degree of caution or tentativeness. And if this is right, then I believe it is raining, but it is not raining is paradoxical because it both asserts and denies the same thing. It commits to the truth of the proposition while simultaneously withdrawing that commitment. Others have analysed the paradox in terms of rational constraints on belief and assertion, arguing that rationality requires a certain coherence between one's beliefs and one's assertions. That if you assert P, you should believe P, and if you believe P, you should regard P as true. And so asserting it is raining, but I do not believe it is raining, violates these coherence requirements. It displays a kind of epistemic irrationality, a failure to properly integrate one's assertions with one's beliefs, even if the statement itself is not logically contradictory. The paradox also has a dual form involving belief rather than assertion. Consider the statement, I believe it is raining, but it is not raining. And again, this may be true. Someone can believe something false, but believing this conjunction seems irrational, because if you believe the first conjunct, that you believe it is raining, and you also believe the second conjunct, that it is not raining, then you are aware that one of your beliefs is false, yet you continue to hold both beliefs. And this seems like a paradigm case of irrationality, holding contradictory beliefs while being fully aware of the contradiction. The more paradoxical statements reveal a kind of blindness that rational agents have about their own beliefs. You cannot rationally believe I believe P, but not P, even though this statement may be true, because believing it requires simultaneously believing P. Since you believe that you believe P, and beliefs about your own beliefs are generally reliable, and believing not P, which is the second conjunct, and so you end up believing both P and not P, which is a straightforward contradiction. And so the more paradoxical belief collapses into an ordinary contradiction when believed, even though it is not a contradiction when merely entertained or stated by someone else. The paradox connects to issues about self-knowledge and the transparency of belief, the idea that we have a special kind of access to our own mental states, that we know what we believe in a way that is different from how we know what others believe. And Moore's paradox suggests that this access is not merely causal or empirical, but involves a kind of rational or conceptual connection, that there are norms governing the relationship between belief and self-ascription of belief, norms that make certain combinations of beliefs irrational even when they are not logically contradictory. The paradox also appears in contexts involving other propositional attitudes. There are more paradoxical statements involving knowledge, such as P is true, but I do not know it, which seem strange to assert even though they may be true. There are billions of truths that any given person does not know, and there are versions involving desire, intention, and other mental states, each revealing similar tensions between the attitude and the self-ascription of that attitude. Some philosophers have argued that Moore's paradox reveals the limits of a purely truth-conditional semantics, the view that the meaning of a sentence is fully captured by its truth conditions, by the conditions under which it is true or false. Because more paradoxical sentences have clear truth conditions. They are true when both conjuncts are true, and yet they are assertorically defective. They cannot be rationally asserted, and this suggests that meaning involves more than truth conditions, that it includes pragmatic dimensions, norms of assertion, and the commitments that speakers undertake when they use language. Others have explored formal models of Moore's paradox using epistemic logic and doxastic logic, systems that formalize reasoning about knowledge and belief. And these formal models can represent the structure of more paradoxical statements and prove that they are not logically contradictory, while also showing why they lead to incoherence when believed or asserted. And this formal work has illuminated the structure of the paradox and connected it to other puzzles in epistemic logic, such as the knowability paradox and the surprise examination paradox. Moore's paradox remains a touchstone in philosophy of mind and language, a simple puzzle that continues to generate insights about the nature of belief, the norms of assertion, the structure of self-knowledge, and the relationship between logic and rationality. And it stands as a reminder that coherence and consistency are more complex than they first appear, that there are ways of being irrational that do not involve believing logical contradictions, that the pragmatics of language use constrain what can be rationally asserted in ways that go beyond the truth or falsity of what is said, and that the relationship between mind and world, between belief and truth, between what we think and what we say, is mediated by norms and commitments that are not fully captured by the formal apparatus of logic. And the statement sits there: it is raining. But I do not believe it is raining. True perhaps, yet absurd, unsayable, a combination of words that no rational speaker would utter. And the paradox persists, a permanent fixture in the landscape of philosophy, a puzzle that illuminates the boundaries of rational thought, the limits of self-knowledge, and the strange logic that governs the relationship between belief and assertion, between what we think and what we can coherently say about what we think. Richard's paradox. In 1905, the French mathematician Jules Richard discovered a paradox that strikes at the heart of how language and mathematics interact, revealing that certain kinds of definitions can generate contradictions no matter how carefully they're constructed. Consider the set of all real numbers that can be defined in a finite number of words using the English language. And this set seems reasonable at first because most numbers we ever think about can be described in some way. Pi is the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. The square root of 2 is the length of the diagonal of a unit square, and so on. Since there are only finitely many words in the English language and only finitely many ways to arrange them into sentences of any given length, there can only be countably many such descriptions, which means there are only countably many real numbers that can be defined in this way. Yet the real numbers are uncountable, as Georg Cantor proved, which means there must exist real numbers that cannot be defined in any finite number of English words, numbers that are forever beyond the reach of language, numbers that exist but cannot be named or described or pointed to in any way. Now comes the paradox. Consider the real number defined as follows. Let it be the first real number in the set of all real numbers that cannot be defined in a finite number of English words, arranged in some standard ordering, such as numerical order. This definition appears to successfully define a specific real number, and the definition itself uses only a finite number of English words, which means the number it defines belongs to the set of numbers that can be defined in a finite number of words, but the definition explicitly states that the number belongs to the set of numbers that cannot be defined in a finite number of words, and so the contradiction emerges, sharp and unavoidable. If the number can be defined, then it does not belong to the set of undefinable numbers, but the definition picks it out precisely as a member of that set. And if it cannot be defined, then the definition fails to refer to anything at all, and yet the definition seems perfectly coherent, grammatically correct, and mathematically precise. Richard's paradox exposes a fundamental problem with the concept of definability, the idea that we can cleanly separate describable objects from indescribable ones, because the act of describing the indescribable creates a loop that collapses into contradiction. Some logicians argue that the phrase cannot be defined in a finite number of words is itself vague or improperly formalized, that it mixes informal natural language with formal mathematical concepts in a way that generates confusion, and that a more rigorous treatment would prevent the paradox from arising. Others suggest that the paradox reveals a hierarchy in language, that definitions must be made within specific formal systems, and that talking about all possible definitions requires stepping outside the system into a meta-language, and that mixing these levels is where the contradiction appears. Alfred Tarski developed this idea into a full theory of truth and definability, showing that no language can fully express its own semantic concepts without risking paradox, that truth and definability must always be relativized to a particular formal system, and that higher-order languages are needed to talk about lower-order ones. Richard's paradox also influenced the development of computability theory, because the question of whether a number can be defined in a finite number of words is closely related to whether it can be computed by a finite algorithm, and paradoxes like Richard's helped clarify the distinction between computable and non-computable reals. The paradox remains a haunting reminder that language, even mathematical language, has limits, that not everything that exists can be captured in words, and that the boundary between the describable and the indescribable is not as stable as it first appears. Morton's fork, when both choices lead to the same doom. A tax collector in 15th century England faces a dilemma when assessing how much wealthy citizens should pay, and the collector observes that some nobles live extravagantly, displaying their wealth openly, and others live frugally, claiming poverty. And Archbishop John Morton, serving as Lord Chancellor under King Henry VII, devises a strategy to extract taxes regardless of which lifestyle the noble chooses, and the strategy is simple and brutal. If a noble lives extravagantly, then clearly they have money and can afford to pay high taxes. And if a noble lives frugally, then clearly they are saving money and must have accumulated wealth and can afford to pay high taxes. And either way, the noble must pay. There is no escape, no strategy that avoids taxation. And this trap, where two apparently opposite choices lead to the same unwanted outcome, became known as Morton's fork, named after the archbishop who wielded it. And the term has entered common usage to describe any situation where someone must choose between two options that both lead to the same undesirable result, where the appearance of choice masks the reality of inevitability. Imagine being a noble in Morton's England, weighing your options, trying to decide whether to live well or live simply, and realizing that either choice leads to heavy taxation, that the tax collector has closed off all escape routes, has constructed a logical trap where your strategy is irrelevant, where you lose regardless of what you choose. And this creates a sense of futility, a recognition that the game is rigged, that the appearance of agency is illusory. And Morton's fork exemplifies a class of situations where apparent choices are not genuine choices, where different paths converge on the same destination, and the only real choice is whether to accept the inevitable or to refuse to play the game at all. The structure of Morton's fork appears throughout logic, rhetoric, and strategy. Wherever someone constructs an argument that covers all cases, that shows that regardless of what premises are accepted, a certain conclusion follows, and such arguments can be powerful tools of persuasion, can trap opponents in positions where they cannot escape the conclusion, but they can also be fallacious, can hide implicit assumptions or false dichotomies, can present apparent inevitability that dissolves under scrutiny. And distinguishing genuine Morton's forks from apparent ones requires careful analysis of whether the two paths really do lead to the same conclusion, or whether there are hidden differences, hidden escape routes. Visualize the fork as a Y-shaped path, two branches diverging, one path representing extravagance and one representing frugality, and both paths lead to the same destination. The tax collector's office and the noble walking either path arrives at the same place. And the fork is not a choice between outcomes, but a choice between routes to a predetermined outcome. And the futility comes from recognizing that movement, that action, that strategy, all are pointless, all lead to the same end, and the only way to avoid the destination is to refuse to walk, to opt out of the entire framework. Morton's fork differs from a dilemma, where two choices lead to different, undesirable outcomes, and the chooser must select the lesser evil, because in Morton's fork, the outcomes are the same, are equally bad, and the choice is between different routes to that bad outcome. And this makes Morton's Fork particularly frustrating, particularly demoralizing, because at least in a dilemma there is a meaningful choice, a decision that matters, but in Morton's Fork the choice does not matter. The outcome is fixed, and the appearance of choice is a cruel illusion. The concept has applications in game theory, in situations where a player's strategies are dominated, where regardless of what the player does, the outcome is worse than some alternative the player cannot access, and recognizing Morton's Forks is important for strategic reasoning, for understanding when continued play is pointless, when the game should be abandoned rather than played, because playing only wastes resources without changing the outcome. Morton's Fork also appears in legal and political contexts, where laws or policies are designed to be inescapable, where any action a person takes falls under the law's scope, and this can be legitimate, can reflect comprehensive regulation of a domain, but it can also be oppressive, can create situations where individuals have no legal way to avoid a burden, no option but compliance, and recognizing such structures is important for identifying injustice, for understanding when law has become a trap rather than a framework for freedom. The paradox also has psychological dimensions, because facing Morton's Fork creates learned helplessness, creates the sense that choices do not matter, that outcomes are predetermined regardless of effort or strategy, and this can lead to resignation, to ceasing to resist, to accepting the inevitable, and oppressive systems often work by creating Morton's Forks, by ensuring that resistance and compliance lead to similar outcomes, that fighting and surrendering are equally futile, and breaking out of Morton's Fork requires either finding a hidden third option, a way to refuse the binary choice, or accepting one path and finding meaning in the choosing, even if the outcome is fixed. Some philosophers argue that life itself is Morton's Fork, that all paths lead to death, that whether we live virtuously or wickedly, happily or miserably, we end up in the same place, non-existent, and this can be a source of nihilism, can undermine the sense that choices matter, but it can also be liberating, can free us to choose based on values rather than outcomes, to recognize that if all paths lead to death, then what matters is the path itself, the journey, not the destination, and Morton's Fork becomes an invitation to find meaning in process rather than result. The Archbishop's strategy was effective, was brutal, extracted taxes efficiently, and the nobles paid, unable to escape the logic, unable to find a strategy that avoided the fork. And Morton's Fork entered history, became a term of art, became a warning about inescapable traps, about situations where apparent choice conceals actual constraint, and the fork remains present in contemporary debates about policy, law, and strategy. A reminder that not all choices are meaningful, that sometimes the appearance of freedom masks the reality of compulsion, and that recognizing Morton's Fork is the first step toward escaping it, toward finding the third option, the refusal to engage, the rejection of the binary. And the fork stands, points in two directions, both leading to the same place, and the challenge is to see the fork for what it is, to recognize when choice is illusory, when strategy is futile, and when the only real option is to walk away, to refuse the fork entirely, to create a new path that the fork's designer did not anticipate. And Morton's Fork remains a timeless trap, a logical structure that appears whenever someone seeks to eliminate all escape routes, to ensure that whatever choice is made, the desired outcome follows, and the fork endures as a reminder that the appearance of choice can be deceptive, that freedom requires more than options, requires that options lead to genuinely different outcomes, and that when options converge, when the fork's prongs meet, choice becomes meaningless, and only opting out restores agency. The analysis paradox. Philosophy has long been concerned with analysis, with taking complex concepts and breaking them down into simpler components, with providing definitions that specify the necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of a term, and this project of conceptual analysis seems both important and straightforward. We want to know what knowledge is, what justice is, what truth is, and we proceed by analysing these concepts, by stating explicitly what they mean, by giving definitions that capture their essential features. Yet there is a paradox lurking here, a puzzle about whether analysis is even possible. And this is the paradox of analysis, first articulated clearly by C.H. Langford, and discussed extensively by G.E. Moore and others in the early 20th century. The paradox can be stated simply: suppose we offer an analysis of some concept. For example, we might analyse the concept brother as male sibling, and this analysis, if correct, should be informative, should tell us something we did not already know about what brotherhood consists in, should illuminate the concept by making its structure explicit. But if the analysis is correct, then the analysandum, the concept being analysed, and the analysans, the analysis itself, must have the same meaning. They must be synonymous, otherwise the analysis would be incorrect. It would not capture what brotherhood really is. And if they are synonymous, then the statement brother means male sibling should be trivial, should be like saying brother means brother, a mere tautology that provides no new information. And so the analysis cannot be both correct and informative. If it is correct, then it is trivial. And if it is informative, then it is not a genuine analysis, but merely a stipulation or a proposed change of meaning. The paradox threatens the entire project of conceptual analysis, because it suggests that analysis cannot do what it is supposed to do, cannot both correctly identify the meaning of a concept and provide new insight into that meaning, cannot be both true and interesting. And so either conceptual analysis is impossible, or our understanding of what analysis is and what it aims to achieve must be revised. One response to the paradox distinguishes between sense and reference, between the meaning of a term and what it picks out, and argues that an analysis can be informative even if the analysandum and analysans refer to the same thing, because they can differ in sense, in the way they present or describe that thing. And so the analysis brother means male sibling is informative, because even though brother and male sibling refer to the same set of individuals, they present that set in different ways, one as a family relation and the other as a combination of gender and kinship. And this difference in sense makes the identity statement informative rather than trivial. Another response appeals to a distinction between conceptual and factual knowledge, arguing that analysis does not provide factual knowledge about the world, but conceptual knowledge about our own concepts, that it makes explicit what was already implicit in our understanding, that it brings to consciousness the structure of concepts that we already possess and use, but have not fully articulated. And so, the informativeness of analysis is not the informativeness of discovering new facts, but the informativeness of self-clarification, of making our own conceptual commitments explicit and transparent. A third response associated with Quine and others skeptical of the analytic-synthetic distinction denies that there is a sharp line between conceptual analysis and empirical investigation, arguing that all beliefs form a holistic web where conceptual revisions and factual discoveries are intertwined, and that what we call analysis is really just careful reflection on our current best theory of the world, subject to revision in light of new evidence or theoretical considerations. And on this view, the paradox dissolves, because analysis is not supposed to be a priori or purely conceptual, but is continuous with empirical inquiry, and so it can be both correct and informative without any mystery. The paradox also raises questions about the methodology of philosophy, about whether philosophy can make progress through analysis or whether some other method is needed. And different philosophical traditions have taken different stances, with analytic philosophy traditionally emphasizing conceptual analysis as a central tool, while continental philosophy has been more skeptical of analysis, focusing instead on interpretation, critique, and phenomenological description, and the paradox of analysis has been one factor driving some philosophers away from traditional analysis toward other approaches. The paradox connects to issues about understanding and competence, because we seem to have a kind of implicit or tacit understanding of concepts like knowledge, justice, and truth. We can use these concepts correctly, can apply them to particular cases, can recognize when they are used inappropriately, and yet when asked to state explicitly what these concepts mean, to provide a definition, we struggle. And this suggests that conceptual competence does not require explicit knowledge of definitions, that understanding can be practical and procedural rather than theoretical and propositional, and that analysis attempts to convert implicit understanding into explicit knowledge, a conversion that is difficult and perhaps impossible to complete without remainder. The paradox also appears in the context of philosophical disagreement, because philosophers have been offering analyses of key concepts for millennia, and yet consensus remains elusive. Different philosophers provide different analyses of knowledge, of justice, of truth, and it is not always clear how to adjudicate between competing analyses, whether by appeal to intuitions about particular cases, by considerations of theoretical simplicity and fruitfulness, or by some other standard, and the lack of agreement raises the question of whether these concepts have determinate meanings that analysis can discover, or whether they are vague, contested, or essentially contested, such that no single analysis could capture all the ways they are legitimately used. The analysis paradox remains a puzzle at the heart of philosophy, a question about what philosophy is doing when it offers definitions and analyses, whether it is discovering pre-existing meanings, stipulating new ones, or engaging in some more complex activity that combines elements of discovery, stipulation, and rational reconstruction, and the paradox has not been definitively resolved. Different philosophers find different responses more or less compelling, and the debate continues, with implications for how we understand the nature and methods of philosophical inquiry. And the concept sits there, waiting to be analysed, inviting us to state its essence, to specify its conditions, to make explicit what we already implicitly know, and yet the analysis, when offered, seems either to tell us nothing new or to change the subject, to offer a different concept rather than clarifying the original one. And the paradox persists, a thorn in the side of analysis, a reminder that understanding is more elusive than it appears, that the gap between knowing how to use a concept and knowing what it means is wider than we thought, and that philosophy, despite its ancient commitment to clarity and definition, to making the implicit explicit and the confused clear, may be chasing a goal that is inherently problematic, inherently paradoxical, a goal that recedes as we approach it, that becomes more obscure the more we try to illuminate it, and yet we continue to analyse, to offer definitions, to seek clarity, because the alternative, giving up on understanding, seems worse. The boy or girl paradox. A family has 2 children, and you're told that at least one of them is a boy, and the question is posed, what is the probability that both children are boys? And the intuitive answer is 1/2, because the other child is either a boy or a girl with equal probability, but this reasoning is incorrect. The actual probability is 1/3, and this is the boy or girl paradox, a puzzle in conditional probability that has generated confusion and debate for decades, with different versions yielding different answers depending on exactly how the information is obtained and what assumptions are made about the selection process. The solution proceeds by considering all possible, equally likely combinations of 2 children. There are 4 possibilities: boy-boy, boy-girl, girl-boy, girl-girl, and girl-girl, where the order matters because the first child and second child are distinct, even if both are boys or both are girls. And if we are told that at least one child is a boy, then the girl-girl possibility is eliminated, leaving 3 equally likely cases: boy-boy, boy-girl, and girl-boy. And only in one of these three cases are both children boys, and so the probability is 1/3, not 1/2. The paradox arises because the conditioning statement, at least one is a boy, is not the same as knowing the gender of a specific child. If instead we are told that the older child is a boy, or the younger child is a boy, then the probability that both are boys becomes 1/2, because we are conditioning on a specific child being a boy rather than on the existential claim that at least one child somewhere in the family is a boy. And this distinction, subtle as it seems, makes a crucial difference to the probability calculation. The boy or girl paradox has many variations that probe the boundaries of the problem and reveal how sensitive the answer is to the exact specification of the scenario. One famous variant involves meeting a man who says he has 2 children, and one of them is a boy named Tuesday, meaning the boy was born on a Tuesday, and this additional information about the day of the week changes the probabilities in a surprising way, because it reduces the number of scenarios consistent with the statement, and the probability that both children are boys increases from 1/3 to 13/27. And this result seems bizarre, seems like the day of the week should be irrelevant, but the mathematics is sound. The additional specificity affects the conditional probabilities. Another variation asks, what if you meet a man with 2 children, and you see one of them, a boy? Does this change the answer? And the answer is yes. Seeing a specific boy is different from being told that at least one child is a boy, because seeing introduces selection effects. You are more likely to see a boy in families with 2 boys than in families with 1 boy, and so the probability calculation must account for the process by which the information was obtained, and different processes lead to different answers. And this sensitivity to selection effects is a general feature of conditional probability problems. And it explains why the boy or girl paradox has multiple defensible answers depending on the scenario. The paradox connects to the reference class problem and to debates about the principle of indifference, because applying the principle of indifference requires specifying a reference class, a set of equally likely outcomes, and different choices of reference class lead to different probability assignments. And in the boy or girl paradox, the reference class could be families with at least 1 boy, or it could be situations where someone tells you that at least one child is a boy. And these are different reference classes with different probabilities. And there is no neutral or obvious way to choose between them without more information about how the scenario is set up. The paradox also raises questions about the interpretation of probability statements in natural language, because phrases like "at least one is a boy" can be interpreted in different ways, as a statement about the existence of a boy in the family, as a statement about what someone knows or has observed, or as a statement about what information has been communicated, and each interpretation leads to different formal models and different probability calculations. And this ambiguity in natural language is a source of many probability paradoxes, where the mathematical answer depends on details that are not fully specified in the informal statement of the problem. Bayesian statisticians and frequentists also interpret the paradox differently. Bayesians treat probability as degrees of belief and calculate conditional probabilities using Bayes' theorem, while frequentists treat probability as long-run frequencies and may question whether the conditional probability is well defined without specifying a clear sampling procedure. And these different philosophical approaches to probability lead to different emphases in how the paradox is understood and resolved, though both traditions agree on the mathematical calculations once the problem is precisely formulated. The boy or girl paradox has practical analogues in genetics and medicine, where the probability of certain conditions depends on family history in ways that are similar to the structure of the paradox. For instance, the probability that a family carries a recessive genetic trait depends on how many children are observed to have the trait, and the calculations must account for ascertainment bias, the fact that families are more likely to come to medical attention if they have affected children, and this bias affects the probability assessments in ways that parallel the selection effects in the boy or girl paradox. The family walks down the street, 2 children beside them, and you know that at least one is a boy, and the question remains, what is the probability that both are boys? And the answer depends on how you came to know this fact, on whether you asked about a specific child or about any child, on whether you saw a boy or were merely told that at least one exists, and each variation of the scenario changes the answer, shifts the probabilities, reveals that conditional probability is sensitive to context, to process, to the mechanisms by which information is acquired and communicated, and the paradox persists as a puzzle, as a teaching tool, as a demonstration of how subtle probability can be, how carefully problems must be formulated, how easily intuition can mislead. And the boy walks ahead, evidence of his existence, shifting probabilities, conditioning beliefs, and the mathematics unfolds, precise and unforgiving, calculating 1/3 or 1/2 or 13/27, depending on the details, and the intuition struggles to keep up, struggles to grasp why the day of the week matters, why seeing is different from being told, why reference classes and selection effects have such profound impacts on what should be simple questions, and the paradox endures, unsettled in the sense that people continue to disagree about which answer is correct for which version, continue to debate whether the problem is well posed, continue to find new variations that test the boundaries of conditional probability, and the family continues walking. The boy or boys or boy and girl continue existing, and the question remains open, answerable only when the scenario is specified with enough precision to eliminate ambiguity, to fix the reference class, to determine the selection process, and until then, the paradox lives on. A reminder that probability is not just mathematics, but interpretation. Not just calculation, but careful attention to how information is obtained, how questions are asked, and how evidence is generated. The Bell spaceship paradox, when 2 rockets pull a string apart, 2 identical spaceships float in space, separated by some distance, let us say 1 kilometer measured in their initial rest frame, and a thin thread connects the 2 ships, stretched taut but not under tension, and now both ships fire their rockets simultaneously, both accelerating at exactly the same rate, both reaching the same velocity at the same time as measured in the original rest frame. And the question arises, what happens to the thread? Does it break or does it remain intact? And the paradox is that 2 different lines of reasoning seem to give opposite answers. One argument says the thread remains intact because both ships accelerate identically and maintain constant separation in the original rest frame, while another argument says the thread must break because of length contraction, and this is Bell's spaceship paradox, proposed by physicist John Stuart Bell to clarify misconceptions about special relativity and the nature of length contraction. Consider the first argument. In the original rest frame, both ships start 1 kilometer apart, and both ships accelerate at the same rate, their velocities remaining equal at all times, and so the distance between them, as measured in the original rest frame, remains 1 kilometer throughout the acceleration. The ships maintain constant separation, as measured by rulers at rest in the original frame, and the thread, stretched between the ships, also spans 1 kilometer in this frame, and if the separation does not change, then why would the thread break? It experiences no increased tension, no stretching, and so the thread should remain intact. And this reasoning seems compelling, seems to follow directly from the symmetry of the situation. But now consider the second argument, from the perspective of someone accelerating with the ships, someone in the instantaneous rest frame of the spaceships at any given moment. And in this frame, the distance between the ships is undergoing length contraction relative to the original frame. The proper distance between the ships, the distance measured by a ruler moving with the ships, is greater than 1 kilometer, and growing because the ships are maintaining constant coordinate separation in the original frame, while length contraction says that moving objects are contracted, and so to maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame, the proper separation must increase, must stretch, and the thread, a physical object with a rest length, cannot stretch indefinitely without breaking, and so the thread must snap as the proper distance between the ships increases beyond the thread's breaking point. Bell's answer, and the correct answer according to relativity, is that the thread breaks. The second argument is correct, and the error in the first argument is subtle. It confuses coordinate distance in the original rest frame with proper distance measured by moving rulers. And length contraction does not mean that objects physically shrink in their own rest frame. It means that the relationship between coordinate distance in one frame and proper distance in another frame involves a contraction factor, and when two ships maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame while accelerating, they are actually increasing their proper separation, the distance measured by rulers that move with them, and the thread, stretched between the ships, experiences this increasing proper separation as tension, and eventually the tension exceeds the thread's strength and it breaks. Imagine the situation more concretely. Place a series of markers at rest in the original frame, spaced 1 meter apart, stretching from the first ship to the second ship. And initially, there are 1,000 markers spanning the 1 kilometer between the ships. And now, the ships accelerate, and at any given instant in the original frame, the ships remain at the same markers they started at. The distance between them measured by these markers remains 1,000 meters, but from the perspective of the moving ships, the markers are getting closer together, are contracting, because the markers are in motion relative to the ships, and so the ships see more and more markers passing between them. The number of markers spanning the gap increases, and this means the proper distance between the ships is increasing, and the thread, which has a fixed rest length, cannot span this increasing proper distance, and it breaks. The paradox reveals a common misconception about special relativity, the idea that if two objects start with a certain separation and undergo identical accelerations, then they must maintain the same separation, but this is false. Maintaining the same coordinate separation in one frame requires increasing proper separation when the objects are accelerating, and this is because acceleration is not relative in the way velocity is. Accelerating objects experience forces, have proper accelerations that can be measured by accelerometers on board, and two spaceships with identical proper accelerations do not maintain constant proper separation. They drift apart in their own instantaneous rest frames. Bell used this paradox to clarify that length contraction is a real physical effect, not merely a coordinate artifact or an optical illusion. The thread really breaks. Real physical forces are involved, and the contraction of moving objects is a consequence of how electromagnetic forces between atoms transform under Lorentz boosts. And these forces are what hold matter together, what give objects their rigidity, and when objects accelerate, the forces adjust. And in the Bell spaceship scenario, the adjustment causes the thread to experience tension and eventually to snap. The paradox also connects to the Ehrenfest paradox, another puzzle in special relativity involving rotation and length contraction, where a disk spinning at relativistic speeds seems to have a contracted circumference but unchanged radius, leading to apparent contradictions with Euclidean geometry. And both paradoxes illustrate that accelerated motion introduces subtleties that are not present in inertial motion, that naive applications of length contraction can lead to errors, and that careful analysis using the full machinery of special relativity is required to get the right answers. Visualize the two spaceships accelerating in lockstep, their separation constant as measured by observers at rest, but the thread between them stretching from the ship's perspective, growing taut, fibers straining and eventually snapping, breaking in the middle, the two halves trailing behind each ship, and the observers at rest see the thread break. even though the ships never changed their coordinate separation. And this breaking is real, is frame independent. All observers agree that the thread broke. Though they may disagree about why, about what forces were involved, but the physical fact of the breaking is invariant, is an event in spacetime that everyone can observe. Bell's spaceship paradox remains a challenging problem in relativity pedagogy. Many students, and even some physicists, initially get it wrong, arguing that the thread should not break. And the paradox serves as a test of whether someone truly understands length contraction and the relativity of simultaneity, whether they can correctly apply these concepts to accelerating objects. And the paradox has generated extensive discussion in physics journals, with papers clarifying the resolution and exploring variations. And it stands as a reminder that special relativity, despite being over a century old, still contains subtleties that require careful thought, that intuitions about space and time must be constantly checked against the formalism, and that even seemingly simple scenarios can hide deep complexities. The rockets fire, the ships accelerate, maintaining constant spacing in the original frame, and the thread stretches, taut and straining, and then snaps, unable to bridge the growing proper distance. And Bell's paradox resolves, the thread breaks, relativity vindicated, and the lesson learned, that acceleration changes things, that maintaining coordinate separation requires increasing proper separation, that length contraction is real and physical, and that relativity continues to surprise, continues to challenge intuition, continues to reward careful analysis with deeper understanding of how space and time and motion interweave to create the strange but consistent fabric of relativistic physics. The bootstrap paradox. There exists a strange loop in time where cause and effect chase each other in a circle, where information or objects appear from nowhere, with no origin, no creator, no beginning, and this is the bootstrap paradox, named after the impossible act of pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps, a paradox that emerges whenever time travel creates a causal loop that has no starting point. Imagine a time traveler who loves a particular symphony, and one day they decide to travel back in time to meet the composer, but when they arrive in the past, they discover that the composer has not yet written the symphony, and so the time traveler, eager to hear the music again, writes down the notes from memory and gives them to the composer, who then publishes it as their own work, and the symphony becomes famous, and years later the time traveler hears it and falls in love with it and decides to travel back in time to meet the composer, and the loop is complete. The question that haunts this scenario is simple and unanswerable. Who actually composed the symphony? The composer received it from the time traveler, and the time traveler received it from the composer, and neither of them created it. The information simply exists within the loop, passed from future to past and back again, with no point of origin, no moment of creation, no author. The bootstrap paradox differs from the grandfather paradox because it does not involve contradiction. The timeline is perfectly self-consistent. Every event follows logically from every other event. There is no clash between cause and effect, and yet something feels deeply wrong, an intuition that things must come from somewhere. That information cannot simply exist without being created. The paradox appears in many variations: a book that writes itself, a watch that is given to a younger version of oneself, who then keeps it for decades before giving it back, a technology that is brought from the future and used to invent itself, and in each case the object or information becomes eternal, trapped in a loop of time, aging perhaps but never truly beginning or ending. Some physicists accept the bootstrap paradox as a genuine possibility if time travel is real, arguing that closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that loop back on themselves, are permitted by general relativity under certain conditions, and that such loops might allow for causally self-sufficient systems where the past and future are mutually dependent. Others find the paradox deeply troubling, a sign that something is wrong with our understanding of causation, entropy, or time itself. Because information in a loop would violate the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy always increases, that order does not arise spontaneously from disorder, and yet in a bootstrap loop, the information appears to be perfectly preserved, never degrading, never increasing in entropy, existing in a kind of timeless stasis. The many worlds interpretation offers one way out, suggesting that the time traveler who delivers the symphony creates a new branch of reality, and that in their original timeline, the symphony had a different origin, but this solution feels like cheating, multiplying universes to avoid the discomfort of the loop. The bootstrap paradox forces confrontation with deep questions about the nature of causation, whether causes must always precede effects, whether the universe permits closed causal loops, and whether existence itself requires an ultimate origin, or whether some things can simply be eternal and self-caused, through time without beginning or end, defying the intuition that everything must come from something, that there must always be a first cause, a prime mover, a starting point from which all else flows. The barber paradox. In a small village, there lives a barber who follows a single rule. He shaves all and only those men in the village who do not shave themselves. And this rule seems simple enough until the question emerges: does the barber shave himself? And suddenly the logic collapses into contradiction. If the barber shaves himself, then he belongs to the group of men who shave themselves, which means according to the rule, he should not shave himself because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, then he belongs to the group of men who do not shave themselves, which means according to the rule, he must shave himself because he shaves all men who do not shave themselves, and the loop tightens without escape, spinning endlessly between two impossible options. Bertrand Russell popularized this version of his own paradox as a way to make the abstract problem of self-referential sets more accessible, more human, more vivid, because a barber is easier to imagine than a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Yet the logical structure remains identical, a rule that turns inward and devours its own coherence. The paradox reveals something unsettling about definitions and categories, that not all rules can be consistently applied, that language and logic can conspire to create situations that seem perfectly reasonable until examined closely, and then they shatter. Some philosophers argue that the barber simply cannot exist, that the rule itself is contradictory, and therefore no such barber could ever follow it in reality, while others suggest that the problem lies in assuming the rule must apply universally, that perhaps the barber is exempt from his own rule, or that the village contains no barber at all. The paradox also exposes the danger of self-reference, the way that statements or rules that loop back on themselves can generate infinite regress or outright contradiction. And this has implications far beyond barbershops, touching mathematics, computer science, law, and any system that attempts to regulate itself from within. In set theory, the barber paradox mirrors Russell's discovery that naive set theory permits the construction of sets that cannot exist without contradiction, forcing mathematicians to impose restrictions on which sets are allowed to form, creating hierarchies and boundaries to prevent self-reference from poisoning the system. The barber stands at the edge of reason, a figure trapped in a loop of his own making, unable to shave or not shave without violating the very rule that defines his existence, and in this way, he becomes a symbol of the limits of logic, a reminder that not every question has an answer, that some problems resist resolution no matter how carefully they are examined. The paradox lingers in the mind, a simple story about a man and a razor that somehow reveals a crack in the foundation of thought itself, and once noticed, it cannot be ignored, appearing again and again wherever rules turn inward, wherever systems attempt to contain themselves, wherever language reaches the boundary of what it can coherently express. The Allais paradox. Maurice Allais, a French economist and Nobel laureate, presented a pair of choices in 1953 that revealed a systematic pattern of preferences violating the independence axiom of expected utility theory, and this became known as the Allais paradox, one of the most influential demonstrations that human decision-making deviates from the prescriptions of standard rational choice theory. And the paradox shows that people's preferences can be influenced by irrelevant alternatives, by outcomes that occur in both options and should therefore cancel out, yet somehow affect which option is chosen. The first choice involves two lotteries. Lottery A offers a certain gain of $1 million, while Lottery B offers a 10% chance of winning $5 million, an 89% chance of winning $1 million, and a 1% chance of winning nothing. And when faced with this choice, most people prefer Lottery A, the certain million, preferring the sure thing to the gamble, even though the gamble has a higher expected value. And this preference reflects risk aversion, a common and generally accepted feature of human decision-making. The second choice involves two different lotteries. Lottery C offers an 11% chance of winning $1 million and an 89% chance of winning nothing, while Lottery D offers a 10% chance of winning $5 million and a 90% chance of winning nothing. And when faced with this choice, most people prefer Lottery D, the gamble with the higher potential payoff, accepting the slightly lower probability of winning in exchange for the much larger prize. The paradox emerges when these two preference patterns are analysed together, because the independence axiom of expected utility theory requires that if Lottery A is preferred to Lottery B, then Lottery C should be preferred to Lottery D. And the reason is that Lotteries A and B differ from Lotteries C and D only in that there is an 89% chance in both A and B of receiving $1 million, and in both C and D this 89% outcome is replaced with winning nothing, and this replacement should affect both lotteries equally, should not change the preference order, because the independence axiom says that preferences between lotteries should depend only on outcomes where the lotteries differ, not on outcomes that are the same in both. And the 89% probability mass is shifted in the same way for both pairs, and so if you prefer A to B, you should also prefer C to D. And if you prefer D to C, you should also prefer B to A. The typical pattern of preferences, A over B and D over C, cannot be represented by any utility function satisfying the expected utility axioms. And so the Allais paradox demonstrates that people systematically violate the independence axiom, that their preferences are sensitive to common outcomes in ways that expected utility theory does not permit. And this violation is robust, appearing in experiments with diverse populations, with real monetary stakes, with careful experimental design, and the paradox cannot be dismissed as error or confusion, but represents a genuine feature of human decision-making. The paradox has inspired alternative theories that can accommodate the observed preferences, including prospect theory, developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, which modifies expected utility theory by introducing reference points, by treating gains and losses differently, by allowing for probability weighting where people overweight small probabilities and underweight large probabilities. And these modifications can explain the Allais preferences, because in the first choice, the certainty of $1 million receives extra weight, making Lottery A more attractive, while in the second choice the small probabilities are overweighted, making the 10% chance of $5 million in Lottery D seem more appealing than the 11% chance of $1 million in Lottery C. Other theories include regret theory, where people anticipate the regret they would feel if they made the wrong choice. And this anticipated regret influences preferences in ways that violate independence, because the certain million in Lottery A avoids the regret of choosing the gamble and losing everything, while the choices between C and D do not have this asymmetry. And rank-dependent utility theory, which generalizes expected utility by allowing the utility of lotteries to depend not just on outcomes and probabilities, but on the rank ordering of outcomes, and this allows for preferences that violate independence while maintaining other desirable properties. The Allais paradox raises normative questions about rationality. Some argue that the independence axiom is a fundamental requirement of rational choice, that violating it leads to incoherence, to preferences that can be exploited through Dutch books or money pumps, to decision-making that is systematically suboptimal, and that people who exhibit Allais preferences are making mistakes and should revise their preferences to conform to expected utility theory. While others argue that the independence axiom, while mathematically convenient, is not a necessary condition for rationality, that it does not capture important aspects of how people value uncertain prospects, that preferences like those in the Allais paradox reflect legitimate concerns about certainty, regret, and the context of choice, and that we should revise our normative theories to accommodate these preferences rather than dismissing them as irrational. The paradox also has practical implications for economics and policy, because if people systematically violate independence, then markets may not function as standard theory predicts. Risk preferences may be context-dependent. Insurance and investment decisions may be influenced by framing effects, and policies designed to maximize expected utility may not align with what people actually prefer. And understanding these deviations from expected utility helps explain phenomena like the equity premium puzzle, the disposition effect, and other anomalies in financial markets and economic behavior. The lotteries sit before you, the choices must be made, and your preferences, revealed through your choices, tell a story about how you value certainty and risk, about how you weigh probabilities and outcomes, and the story violates the axioms of rational choice, violates the clean mathematical structure of expected utility theory, and yet the choices feel reasonable, feel justified, feel like they reflect something important about value and uncertainty that the theory misses, and the paradox persists. The gap between theory and behavior remains. The independence axiom is violated again and again in experiments and in life, and decision theorists must choose. Either insist that the axiom is normatively binding and that violators are irrational, or acknowledge that the axiom is too strong, that rational choice is more complex than expected utility allows, and that new theories are needed to capture the richness of human decision-making. And the Allais paradox remains a landmark, a decisive demonstration that classical rational choice theory does not fully describe or prescribe human behavior, a challenge that spawned new theories and new research programs, and a reminder that rationality is contested, that what counts as a reasonable choice depends on assumptions and frameworks that are themselves open to question, and the lotteries remain, the choices remain, the preferences remain, and the paradox endures, unsolved in the sense that no consensus has emerged about whether the preferences are rational or irrational, about whether we should revise our theories or our preferences, about whether independence is a negotiable axiom or a non-negotiable requirement. And the debate continues. Philosophers and economists and psychologists arguing about what rationality requires, about what humans actually do, and about the relationship between these two questions. Synesthesia. Paradox. Why numbers have colours and sounds have tastes. A person looks at the number 5 and sees it as blue, not imagines it as blue, not associates it with blue, but actually sees blue, experiences colour as an intrinsic property of the number. And another person hears music and tastes chocolate, hears certain chords, and the taste appears involuntarily, automatically. And these experiences are synesthesia, are cross-modal sensory experiences where stimulation in one modality produces perception in another, and synesthesia is not metaphor, is not learned association, is a genuine perceptual phenomenon experienced by roughly 4% of the population. And the paradox is that synesthetes experience properties that are not physically present, see colours that are not in the stimulus, taste flavours that have no source, and yet these experiences are consistent, are reliable. The same numbers always evoke the same colours, the same sounds always evoke the same tastes, and this reliability distinguishes synesthesia from imagination or association, shows that synesthesia is automatic, is perceptual rather than cognitive, and the phenomenon reveals something fundamental about how the brain is organised, shows that sensory modalities are not strictly separate, but can communicate, can influence each other, and synesthesia represents an extreme of this cross-modal interaction, represents a neural architecture where connections between sensory areas are stronger than normal, are sufficient to produce conscious experiences in one modality when another is stimulated. Imagine being a grapheme colour synesthete, the most common form where letters and numbers evoke colours, and you read this text and every letter has its own colour. A is red, B is green, C is yellow, and the colours are vivid, are as clear as real colours, are not vague or imagined but are perceptually present. And when you see the letter A, you cannot help but see red. The colour is automatic, is triggered by the visual form of the letter, and this colouring happens for all letters and numbers, creates a richly coloured experience of reading. And while this might sound beautiful, it can also be distracting, can interfere with reading when the printed colours conflict with synesthetic colours, can create confusion, and yet for synesthetes, this is normal, is how the world has always looked. And they are often surprised to learn that others do not experience letters as coloured, that the colours are unique to synesthetes. Synesthesia demonstrates that perception is not modular, is not strictly segregated by sensory modality, and in synesthetes there is cross-activation. There are connections between sensory areas that do not exist or are weaker in non-synesthetes, and these connections allow activity in one area to trigger activity in another. And when grapheme area, the region that processes letter and number shapes, is activated, it also activates colour area, the region that processes colour, and this cross-activation produces the experience of coloured letters. And neuroimaging studies have confirmed this, have shown that when synesthetes see numbers, colour areas of visual cortex are activated, are lit up, and this activation is automatic, is bottom-up, is not produced by conscious thought or imagination, but is triggered by the stimulus itself. Visualize the brain as having sensory areas that are normally separate: visual area, auditory area, taste area, and these areas process their respective inputs and pass information to higher level regions. But in synesthetes there are additional connections. There are pathways between sensory areas that allow direct crosstalk, and these pathways are the neural basis of synesthesia, are what allows stimulation in one modality to produce experiences in another. And the connections are not learned, are not created through experience, but are developmental, are present from early life. And synesthesia is lifelong, is consistent. The same cross-modal experiences occurring throughout the synesthete's life. The synesthesia paradox is that these experiences are perceptual, are as real as any other perception, and yet the properties perceived are not present in the stimulus. The number 5 is not blue, is black on white, and yet the synesthete sees blue. And this challenges theories that say perception is veridical, is accurate, is a representation of physical reality. And synesthesia shows that perception can include properties that are not in the world, that are generated internally, and yet these properties feel external, feel like properties of objects rather than like internal mental states. And this raises questions about the nature of perception, about what it means for perception to be of something, about whether all perception involves some degree of construction, some degree of adding properties that are not in the stimulus. One theory of synesthesia is that everyone is born with extensive cross-modal connections, that infant brains have connections between all sensory areas, and during development, most of these connections are pruned, are eliminated, and sensory areas become more segregated. And in synesthetes, some of these early connections are preserved, are not pruned, and this preservation allows the cross-modal experiences to continue into adulthood. And this theory is supported by evidence that infants show some synesthetic effects, show cross-modal correspondences, and that synesthesia runs in families, has a genetic component, suggesting that genes that regulate synaptic pruning are involved. Another theory is that synesthesia involves disinhibition, involves normally present connections between sensory areas that are usually inhibited, are suppressed, and in synesthetes this inhibition is weakened, is less effective, and so the connections are active, allow cross-activation, and this theory is supported by evidence that synesthesia can be induced temporarily in non-synesthetes through drugs that reduce inhibition, through hypnosis, through sensory deprivation, suggesting that the neural machinery for synesthesia is present in everyone, but is normally inhibited, and synesthetes have less inhibition, have more open channels between sensory areas. Synesthesia also has practical implications. Some synesthetes report that their experiences are useful, provide memory aids, make information more distinctive, easier to remember, and some musicians with sound colour synesthesia report that the colours help with composition, with understanding musical structure, and some artists deliberately cultivate synesthetic experiences, use them as sources of creativity. And understanding synesthesia has implications for education, for recognising that people process information differently, that sensory experiences vary across individuals, and that teaching should accommodate these differences, should recognise that some students have richly coloured experiences of letters and numbers, while others do not. The phenomenon also raises questions about consciousness, about qualia, about the subjective properties of experience, because synesthetes have different qualia than non-synesthetes, have colour experiences that others do not, and this shows that consciousness is not uniform, is not the same across individuals, and qualia vary, and this variation is not just quantitative, is not just more or less of the same experience, but is qualitative, involves entirely different types of experience, and this challenges theories that say consciousness is universal, is the same for everyone, and supports theories that say consciousness is individual, is constructed by each brain in potentially different ways. And synesthesia is one example of this variation, is one way that consciousness can differ. Some philosophers argue that synesthesia shows that perception is not representational, does not represent external properties, because the colours seen by graphema colour synesthetes do not represent anything in the world. The number 5 is not blue, and yet the colour is perceived, and this challenges representational theories of perception, suggests that perceptual experiences are not always representations of external properties but can be internally generated responses. And synesthesia is a case where the response includes properties that are not being represented, and this raises questions about what makes perception representational, whether all aspects of perception are representations or whether some are merely responses are produced by the perceptual system without representing anything external. The number appears black on white, and the synesthete sees blue, vivid and automatic. The colour is as real as the number, is as perceptually present, and yet the colour is not there, is not in the stimulus, is generated by the brain, is a cross-modal activation, and the synesthesia paradox remains. Perception includes non-veridical properties, includes experiences that do not correspond to stimulus properties, and yet these experiences are automatic, are reliable, are as perceptually real as any other, and synesthesia endures as one of the most fascinating phenomena in neuroscience, a demonstration that sensory modalities are not strictly separate, that cross-modal connections exist, that perception can include internally generated properties, and that consciousness varies across individuals, includes experiences that are unique, that are not shared by everyone, and the colours remain overlaid on letters, triggered by sounds, evoked by tastes, And the cross-modal world of synesthetes continues, different from the world non-synesthetes perceive, richer in some ways, more confusing in others, and the phenomenon persists. Nagel's bat problem, why you can never know what it's like to be anything else. A philosopher contemplates a bat hanging upside down in a cave, navigating through echolocation, emitting high-frequency sounds and listening to the echoes, building a sonic map of the world. And the philosopher asks what it is like to be a bat. What is the subjective character of bat experience? What does echolocation feel like from the inside? And philosopher Thomas Nagel argues that no amount of objective information about bat neuroscience, about bat behavior, about the physics of sonar, can tell us what bat experience is like, because subjective experience has an essential first-person character, a what it is likeness that cannot be captured from the third-person objective perspective of science, and the gap between objective description and subjective experience is unbridgeable. And this means that consciousness, at least in its subjective aspect, resists scientific explanation, resists reduction to physical terms. And this is Nagel's bat problem, presented in his famous 1974 paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And the problem illustrates the explanatory gap between physical facts and phenomenal facts, shows that subjective experience involves something that objective science cannot capture, and challenges physicalist theories of mind to explain how subjective character could be accommodated within a purely physical framework. Imagine trying to know what echolocation is like, trying to understand bat experience from the inside, and you learn all the objective facts. Learn about the bat's auditory system, about how it processes echoes, about which brain regions are involved. And this knowledge is real, is valuable, tells you how echolocation works, but it does not tell you what it feels like, does not give you access to the bat's subjective experience, to the phenomenology of navigating by sound. And Nagel's point is that this gap is not due to practical limitations, not due to insufficient technology or incomplete knowledge, but is a fundamental gap between objective and subjective perspectives, between what can be known from outside and what can only be known from inside. And no amount of objective knowledge can bridge this gap, can provide access to subjective experience. The bat problem generalizes beyond bats to any creature with a different sensory modality, a different nervous system, a different form of consciousness. And Nagel uses bats because they are mammals, are relatively similar to humans, yet have a sensory mode, echolocation, that humans lack. And this combination makes the example vivid, makes the gap between human and bat experience clear. And if we cannot know what it is like to be a bat, then we certainly cannot know what it is like to be a fish, an insect, an octopus, creatures whose nervous systems and sensory worlds are even more alien. And this suggests that consciousness, in its subjective aspect, is fundamentally private, is accessible only to the being who has it, and different kinds of consciousness are mutually inaccessible, cannot be fully understood from outside. Visualize the subjective character of experience as the view from inside, the first-person perspective, the what it is likeness. And this perspective is essential to consciousness, is what makes consciousness consciousness rather than merely information processing. And Nagel argues that physicalism, the view that everything is physical, must either deny that subjective character exists, which seems false because we all know from our own case that consciousness has a subjective character, or must explain how subjective character could be physical, how objective physical facts could constitute subjective, first-person experiences. And this explanation is what physicalism has not provided, what the bat problem challenges physicalism to provide. One response to the bat problem accepts the explanatory gap, but denies that it shows anything metaphysical, argues that the gap is merely epistemological, is about the limits of what we can know, rather than about the nature of reality, and consciousness might be physical, even though we cannot fully understand it from the objective third-person perspective. And just as we cannot know what it is like to be a bat, we also cannot know what it is like to be another human, cannot fully access their subjective experiences, and yet we do not conclude that human consciousness is non-physical. And so the bat problem shows limits of knowledge, but not limits of physicalism, shows that subjective experience has aspects that resist objective description, but not that these aspects are non-physical. Another response argues that future science might bridge the gap, might develop ways of understanding subjective character objectively, might create theories that capture phenomenology in physical terms, and our current inability to imagine how this could be done does not prove that it cannot be done. And Nagel's argument trades on current ignorance, assumes that the gap is permanent, when it might be merely temporary, and this response is optimistic about the prospects for physicalist explanations of consciousness, believes that the hard problem and the bat problem will eventually be solved by scientific progress. A third response from Nagel's position argues that the bat problem reveals something deep about the structure of reality, that consciousness has an irreducibly subjective aspect, an aspect that cannot be captured by objective physical description. And this does not mean consciousness is non-physical in the sense of being immaterial or supernatural, but it means that physicalism, as traditionally conceived, is incomplete, misses something essential about consciousness. And a complete theory of reality must include both objective physical facts and subjective phenomenal facts. And these two kinds of facts cannot be reduced to each other. And this position is sometimes called naturalistic dualism, accepts that consciousness is natural, is part of the natural world, but denies that it is reducible to physics. The bat problem also has implications for artificial intelligence, for whether machines could be conscious, because if we cannot know what it is like to be a bat, then we also cannot know what it is like to be a computer, cannot know whether AI systems have subjective experiences, and the bat problem suggests that behavioral evidence is insufficient, that even if a machine passes every behavioral test, exhibits intelligence, responds appropriately to stimuli, we still cannot know whether there is something it is like to be that machine, whether there is subjective experience behind the behavior, and this creates a permanent epistemic barrier, a limit on what we can know about machine consciousness. The bat hangs in the cave, emitting sounds, perceiving the world through echoes, and its experience is alien, is inaccessible to human understanding. And Nagel's question remains, what is it like? And the answer is we do not know, cannot know, because knowing requires access to the subjective perspective, requires being the bat or having the bat's sensory and cognitive capacities, and neither is possible. And so bat consciousness remains a mystery, remains forever beyond human comprehension. And this mystery is not unique to bats but applies to all consciousness, to the fundamental subjectivity of experience, to the what it is likeness that defines phenomenal consciousness. And Nagel's bat problem endures as one of the most influential thought experiments in philosophy of mind, a vivid illustration of the explanatory gap, a challenge to physicalist theories, and a reminder that consciousness, in its subjective aspect, resists objective description, resists scientific reduction, and remains one of the deepest puzzles about the nature of mind and reality. And the bat flies through the cave, navigating by sound, living its bat life, having its bat experiences, and what those experiences are like remains unknown, remains unknowable. And the problem persists, the gap between objective knowledge and subjective experience, the difference between knowing about consciousness and knowing consciousness from the inside. And Nagel's question echoes, what is it like to be a bat? And no answer comes, no answer can come, and the problem stands as a permanent marker of the limits of objective understanding, the irreducible subjectivity of experience and the mystery at the heart of consciousness. Parfit's teletransportation paradox. Imagine a future where technology allows instant travel across vast distances through a process called teletransportation. A device scans your body down to the atomic level, recording the exact position and state of every particle, and then transmits this information to a distant location where another device reconstructs you perfectly, assembling a body atom by atom according to the transmitted blueprint. And the reconstruction is flawless, every memory intact, every scar reproduced, every thought continued, and the reconstructed person steps out of the receiving chamber, believing themselves to be you, feeling no discontinuity, no sense that anything strange has occurred. The philosopher Derek Parfit asked a disturbing question about this process. Are you the person who steps out of the receiving chamber, or did you die in the scanning chamber? And a copy, a duplicate with all your memories and personality, is now living your life. And if the scanning process destroys the original body as it records the information, then perhaps it is still you, continuous in some sense. But what if the original body is not destroyed? What if the scanner leaves you standing in the departure chamber, intact and alive, while the reconstruction appears in the receiving chamber? And now there are two of you, both with equal claim to being the original, both feeling that they are you, and if both are you, then identity has become plural. But if only one is you, then which one and what criterion could possibly distinguish them when they are physically and psychologically identical? Parfit used this thought experiment to challenge the intuition that personal identity is what matters in survival, arguing that what matters is not identity, not being numerically the same person, but rather psychological continuity and connectedness, the preservation of memories, personality, beliefs, desires, and ongoing projects. And if these are preserved, then survival has occurred even if strict identity has not. And so, the reconstructed person is you in every way that matters, even if they are not numerically identical to the original you. And the question of whether identity is preserved is a question about what we care about rather than a deep metaphysical fact. The paradox becomes more troubling when variations are introduced. Suppose the teletransportation device malfunctions and creates not one, but two reconstructions, both perfect, both claiming to be you, and now identity must branch, which seems impossible because identity is supposed to be a one-to-one relation. A thing is identical only to itself, and yet both reconstructions have an equal claim. And if identity is not preserved in this case, then why should it be preserved in the normal case where only one reconstruction appears? And if it is not preserved, then every time you use the teletransporter, you die, and a new person with your memories takes your place, living a life they falsely believe is a continuation of yours. Parfit embraced the conclusion that identity is not what matters, that we should care about psychological continuity rather than numerical identity, and that the concept of a persisting self, a single unified person who endures over time, is less important than we ordinarily think. That what makes your future self matter to you now is not that they are literally the same person, but that they are psychologically connected to you in the right ways. And if those connections can branch or spread across multiple individuals, then so be it. Identity is not sacred, not the ultimate ground of value or concern. The teletransportation paradox has implications for how we think about personal survival, about whether what matters in death is the cessation of psychological continuity or the cessation of biological life, about whether uploading consciousness to a computer or creating digital copies would constitute survival or merely the creation of simulacra, and about whether the self is a metaphysical entity or a convenient fiction we use to organize experience. The paradox also challenges intuitions about moral responsibility, because if identity is vague or plural, then questions about who is responsible for past actions or who deserves future rewards become murky, and the unity of the person, which underpins much of ethics and law, begins to dissolve. Parfit's teletransportation scenario remains one of the most powerful thought experiments in philosophy, a story that uses imaginable technology to expose deep questions about identity, survival, and what it means to be a person, forcing recognition that the boundaries of the self, like the boundaries of clouds and cats, may be far less clear and far less important than common sense suggests, and that the question of whether you survive. Teletransportation may have no determinate answer, or many answers, or may simply be the wrong question to ask. Newcomb's paradox. A being with perfect or near-perfect predictive abilities presents you with two boxes, one transparent and one opaque. And the rules of the game are simple, but the decision is agonizing. And this is Newcomb's paradox, a thought experiment devised by physicist William Newcomb and popularized by philosopher Robert Nozick that has divided decision theorists and philosophers into rival camps for decades. The transparent box contains $1,000, visible and certain, while the opaque box contains either $1 million or nothing, and the amount depends on a prediction made by the being before you arrived. If the being predicted you would take only the opaque box, then it placed $1 million inside. But if it predicted you would take both boxes, then it left the opaque box empty. The being has made this offer to many people before, and has never been wrong. Its predictions are accurate with such consistency that it seems to know the future, or at least to understand human psychology so deeply that it can foresee choices with near certainty. Now you must decide, do you take only the opaque box, trusting the prediction and hoping for $1 million? Or do you take both boxes, reasoning that whatever is in the opaque box is already determined, and you might as well collect the extra $1,000 from the transparent box? The paradox arises because two different principles of rational decision-making give opposite answers, and both seem compelling. The expected utility calculation favors taking only the opaque box, because if the being is almost always right, then taking only the opaque box gives you a high probability of receiving $1 million, while taking both boxes gives you a high probability of receiving only $1,000, and so the one-box strategy maximizes expected value. But the dominance principle suggests taking both boxes, because at the moment you make your choice, the contents of the boxes are already fixed. The being has already made its prediction and either placed the $1 million or not. And since the past cannot be changed, your decision cannot affect what is in the opaque box. And therefore, taking both boxes gives you $1,000 more than taking only the opaque box. No matter what the opaque box contains, and dominance reasoning says you should always choose the option that does better in every possible state of the world. The paradox forces a choice between two deeply held intuitions about rationality: the idea that rational agents should maximize expected utility, and the idea that rational agents should not leave money on the table when doing so cannot possibly make things worse. Philosophers and decision theorists remain divided. Some are one-boxers who argue that the being's predictive accuracy makes the dominance reasoning irrelevant, that the correlation between your choice and the contents of the box is so strong that you should act as if your decision causally affects the prediction, even though temporally it does not. While others are two boxers who insist that causal reasoning demands taking both boxes, that the prediction is already made and your choice now cannot retroactively change it, and that one-boxers are falling prey to magical thinking, confusing correlation with causation. The paradox also touches on issues of free will and determinism, because if the being can predict your choice with perfect accuracy, then in what sense is the choice free? And if the choice is not free, then what does it mean to deliberate about it? And if determinism is true, does that undermine the concept of rational decision-making altogether? Newcomb's paradox has inspired the development of new decision theories, including causal decision theory, which endorses two-boxing, and evidential decision theory, which endorses one-boxing, as well as more exotic approaches like timeless decision theory and functional decision theory, which attempt to handle cases where agents can predict or simulate each other. The paradox remains unresolved, a strange meeting point of probability, causation, choice, and prediction, a puzzle that reveals how little we understand about what it means to decide, and whether the principles we use to navigate an uncertain world are as solid as we believe, or whether they crumble when pressed against beings who can see through us, who know what we will do before we do it, who turn decision-making into a game where the rules themselves are in question. Russell's paradox. In the year 1901, a young mathematician named Bertrand Russell discovered a contradiction so profound that it shattered the foundations of mathematics and forced an entire generation of logicians to rebuild their discipline from the ground up. And this contradiction became known as Russell's paradox, a simple question about sets that revealed a fatal flaw in the way mathematicians understood collections and categories. A set is merely a collection of objects, and sets can contain anything: numbers, colours, ideas, even other sets. And at first this seems harmless enough. A set of all chairs, a set of all prime numbers, a set of all books ever written. Some sets contain themselves as members and some do not. And this too seems straightforward. A catalogue of all catalogues would include itself because it is also a catalogue, while a list of all fruit does not include itself because a list is not a fruit. Russell posed a deceptively innocent question. Consider the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Does this set contain itself? And the mind stumbles immediately into contradiction. If the set contains itself, then by definition it should not contain itself, because the rule states it only includes sets that do not contain themselves. But if it does not contain itself, then it must include itself, because it fits the criteria perfectly. And so the paradox loops without end, a perfect logical knot that cannot be untied. This was not merely a clever riddle or a philosophical curiosity, it was a disaster for mathematics, because at the time, mathematicians believed they could organize all of mathematical knowledge using set theory, a system proposed by Georg Cantor that treated sets as the fundamental building blocks of reality. But Russell's paradox proved that naive set theory was inconsistent, that it allowed contradictions to exist within its structure, and if contradictions are permitted, then anything can be proven true or false, rendering the entire system useless. Russell himself compared the paradox to a barber in a village who shaves all and only those men who do not shave themselves. And the question arises, does the barber shave himself? And if he does, then he should not, because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But if he does not, then he must, because he shaves all men who do not shave themselves. And the loop tightens again. Mathematicians scrambled to patch the damage, and various solutions emerged over the following decades. Zermelo and Frankel developed a new version of set theory that imposed strict rules about which sets could exist, forbidding the kind of self-reference that allowed Russell's paradox to form, while type theory introduced hierarchies that prevented sets from containing themselves by assigning different logical levels to different kinds of objects. Others embraced paraconsistent logic, systems that allow contradictions without collapse, or rejected the entire project of grounding mathematics in set theory, seeking new foundations altogether. Russell's paradox also influenced philosophy beyond mathematics, touching on questions of language, meaning, and self-reference, revealing that not all grammatically correct statements are logically coherent, that some sentences create traps from which reason cannot escape. The paradox appears in unexpected places. In computer science, where recursive definitions can cause programs to crash, in legal systems where laws reference themselves in contradictory ways, in everyday thought whenever categories attempt to classify themselves. It stands as a reminder that even the most rigorous systems of thought contain limits, that logic itself is not immune to paradox, that the quest for certainty and completeness may be forever haunted by statements that twist back on themselves and devour their own meaning. The Chinese room argument, why understanding takes more than following rules. A philosopher sits alone in a room, and through a slot in the door come pieces of paper with Chinese characters written on them, and the philosopher does not understand Chinese, cannot read the characters, has no idea what they mean, but the philosopher has a rule book, an enormous book of instructions written in English that specifies for every possible input what output to produce. And the rules are purely syntactic. Say things like, if you receive these characters, then copy these other characters onto paper and send them out. And the philosopher follows the rules mechanically, receives Chinese input, looks up the appropriate response in the rule book, writes the Chinese characters, and sends the paper out through the slot. And to outside observers who understand Chinese, the responses are perfect, are indistinguishable from responses a native Chinese speaker would give. The system appears to understand Chinese, appears to be conversing intelligently, and yet the philosopher inside understands nothing, is merely manipulating symbols according to formal rules. And this is John Searle's Chinese room argument, proposed in 1980 as a challenge to strong AI, to the claim that running the right program is sufficient for understanding, is sufficient for genuine cognition, and the argument aims to show that syntax is not sufficient for semantics, that symbol manipulation is not sufficient for meaning, that computers running programs are like the philosopher in the room, manipulating symbols without understanding what they mean. Imagine the situation from the philosopher's perspective, sitting with the rule book, receiving incomprehensible squiggles, looking up responses, writing more incomprehensible squiggles, and sending them out. And at no point does understanding occur, at no point do the symbols acquire meaning. The philosopher remains ignorant of Chinese throughout the process, despite producing perfect Chinese responses. And Searle's point is that if the philosopher does not understand Chinese, then neither does any computer system that works the same way, that processes inputs according to formal rules to produce outputs. And since all computer programs work by manipulating symbols according to formal rules, no computer program can produce genuine understanding, can produce semantics, no matter how sophisticated the program, how large the rulebook, how perfect the response is. The argument is directed against the computational theory of mind, against the idea that cognition is computation, that thinking is symbol manipulation, that minds are programs running on brains. And Searle argues that this view is false, that minds have more than computational properties, that understanding requires something beyond syntax, something like intentionality, the capacity for thoughts to be about things, to have meaning, and intentionality is not a computational property, is not something that emerges from symbol manipulation. And so computers, which are purely computational systems, cannot have genuine understanding, cannot have genuine intelligence, no matter how complex their programs. Visualize the difference between a human understanding Chinese and the system of the room. The human has intentional states, has thoughts that are about things, knows what words mean, knows what is being said, while the room system has only syntax, has only formal symbol manipulation, and the symbols in the room are not about anything, do not mean anything to the system, are just meaningless marks manipulated according to rules. And Searle argues that this difference is fundamental, that no amount of syntactic processing can produce genuine semantics, cannot bridge the gap between meaningless symbols and meaningful thoughts. The Chinese room argument has generated enormous discussion and numerous objections. The system's reply argues that while the philosopher does not understand Chinese, the system as a whole, the philosopher plus the rulebook plus the room, does understand Chinese, and understanding is a property of the system, not of the components. And Searle responds that this misses the point, that even considering the entire system, there is nothing that understands Chinese. The system is still just manipulating symbols and internalizing the rulebook. Imagining the philosopher memorizes all the rules does not help. The philosopher still does not understand Chinese, still is just following rules. The robot reply argues that a computer embedded in a robot body, with sensors and actuators, with the ability to interact with the world, could ground symbols in experience, could connect symbols to things, And this grounding would provide semantics, would provide understanding. And Searle responds that this just adds more symbol manipulation. The robot receives perceptual inputs, processes them through programs, produces motor outputs. But all of this is still syntactic, still formal symbol manipulation, and adding perception and action does not add semantics, does not add understanding. The robot is just a Chinese room with cameras and arms. The brain simulator reply argues that if the program simulated the actual brain processes involved in understanding Chinese, neuron by neuron, then running the program would produce understanding. Because understanding is what brains do, and the simulation reproduces what brains do. And Searle responds with the thought experiment of replacing neurons with silicon chips one by one, and asks whether at some point understanding suddenly disappears, and argues that if understanding depends on specific biological properties of neurons, then simulation is insufficient. And if understanding depends only on computational properties, then simulation has them and still does not produce understanding, showing that computation is not enough. The other mind's reply argues that we attribute understanding to other humans based on their behavior, and if a computer produces the same behavior, we should attribute understanding to it by the same reasoning. And Searle responds that this is an epistemological point about how we know others understand. But his argument is a metaphysical point about what understanding is, and behaviorally equivalent systems might differ in whether they genuinely understand, and the Chinese room shows that behavioral equivalence does not guarantee understanding. Supporters of strong AI have largely rejected the Chinese room argument, have argued that Searle begs the question by assuming there is something more to understanding than syntactic processing, that he relies on intuitions about the philosopher's lack of understanding without justifying those intuitions, and that if the system perfectly duplicates the behavior of a Chinese understander, then it is a Chinese understander. An understanding is not a mysterious inner property, but is constituted by the right functional organization, the right pattern of information processing, and the Chinese room system has that organization. The argument also raises questions about what understanding is, what makes the difference between genuine and merely apparent understanding, and whether there could be a fact of the matter about whether a system understands or whether understanding is something we attribute based on pragmatic considerations. And Searle argues that understanding involves consciousness, involves subjective experience, involves intentionality, and these are biological phenomena that cannot be duplicated by computation, while functionalists argue that understanding is a matter of functional organization, and any system with the right organization understands regardless of its physical implementation. The philosopher sits in the room, manipulating Chinese characters, following rules, producing perfect responses, and understanding nothing, and the question remains whether this thought experiment refutes strong AI, whether it shows that computation is insufficient for understanding, or whether it merely trades on intuitions about the thought experiment that should not be trusted. And the Chinese room argument persists as one of the most influential arguments in philosophy of mind and AI, an argument that has shaped debates about consciousness, intentionality, and the nature of minds, an argument that continues to challenge the computational theory of mind. And the room remains. The philosopher remains, following rules, producing symbols, understanding nothing, and Searle's challenge endures, demanding explanation of how syntax could ever produce semantics, how symbol manipulation could ever produce meaning, and the argument stands as a permanent thorn in the side of strong AI, a thought experiment that forces advocates of computational theories to explain what their theories cannot easily explain, how understanding emerges from computation, how minds can be programs, and whether machines can think. The card paradox. Imagine a card, simple and rectangular, lying flat on a table, and on one side is written a single sentence. The statement on the other side of this card is true, and already the mind begins to sense danger, a trap being set. The card is flipped over, and on the reverse side another sentence appears. The statement on the other side of this card is false. And now the contradiction is complete. A perfect loop of mutual negation that cannot be resolved no matter how many times the card is turned. If the first side is true, then the second side must be true, as the first side claims, but if the second side is true, then the first side must be false, as the second side claims, which contradicts the assumption that the first side is true. And if the first side is false, then the second side must be false, as the first side incorrectly claims it is true. But if the second side is false, then the first side must be true, as the second side incorrectly claims it is false, and the cycle spirals endlessly without rest. The card paradox is a variation of the liar paradox, but its physical form makes the contradiction feel more tangible, more concrete, a paradox that can be held in the hand and turned over and over as if repetition might somehow reveal a hidden answer that logic cannot provide. The paradox demonstrates how self-reference can be distributed across multiple statements rather than contained in a single sentence, showing that contradictions do not need to be immediate or obvious to be genuine, that they can emerge from relationships between statements rather than from the statements themselves. Philip Jourdan, a mathematician and logician, is often credited with popularizing this version of the paradox in the early 20th century, using it to explore the limits of truth and reference, and to illustrate the kinds of problems that plagued attempts to formalize logic and mathematics during that era. The card paradox also reveals something about the nature of truth itself, the way that truth is not a property that statements possess in isolation, but a relationship between statements and the world, or between statements and other statements. And when those relationships form closed loops, the concept of truth begins to break down. Some philosophers argue that the statements on the card are neither true nor false, but meaningless, that they fail to refer to anything outside themselves and therefore do not qualify as genuine propositions, while others suggest that the paradox exposes a flaw in the classical assumption that every statement must be either true or false, that perhaps some statements occupy a third category, undefined or indeterminate. The card sits on the table, innocent and menacing, a small object that contains an infinite problem, and no amount of flipping will resolve what is written on its surfaces. No clever interpretation will untangle the knot, and so it remains, a monument to the limits of language and logic, a reminder that not all questions have answers, that some truths are forever out of reach, caught in loops that reason cannot break.